When the guns of Europe fell silent over France in 1940, the mighty B1 Bis tanks, once the pride of French armour, stood abandoned among the wreckage of defeat. A glorious symbol of French engineering, the B1 Bis fell into Axis control after France's defeat. Rather than scrap its hulking frame, Italian designers saw an opportunity. They stripped away the distinctive turret and refitted the chassis to create a turretless, self-propelled gun prototype, a hybrid that fused French design strength with Italian improvisation. Though it never reached mass production, the Semovente B1 Bis revealed the Italians' resourcefulness and the constant experimentation that defined wartime innovation. The Semovente B1 Bis was a truly unique experiment in wartime adaptation, a fusion of the French Char B1 Bis heavy tank and Italian self-propelled gun doctrine. Unlike typical Semovente conversions, which were based on Italian medium tanks like the M1340 and fitted with a new casemate superstructure, the B1 Bis conversion repurposed an enemy design with formidable armour and a distinct configuration. Italian engineers transformed the B1 Bis from a turreted tank into a turretless vehicle to be used as an assault gun. Italy needed more armour, and the hull of the B1 Bis certainly met this requirement. The Char B1 Bis was France's heavy tank, a tank that is considered to be the most powerful in 1940. The idea for the tank was conceived back in the 1920s, with development continuing through the early 1930s, entering service in 1935. The tank had thick armour and two capable armaments for the time, a 75mm cannon fixed in the hull for forward firing and a 47mm cannon in its small turret. The tank was designed as a heavy breakthrough, the kind of tank the Italians were looking for on the outbreak of the war. The design wouldn't have looked out of place during the First World War, quite narrow and elongated with large tracks and suspension surrounding the tank's hull. It was designed to cross trenches. It was a troublesome tank for the Germans during the Battle of France, the tank's armour proving impenetrable for the smaller panzer tanks. The B1 Bis had 55 to 60mm of frontal armour, but it was by no means a perfect tank. It was difficult to operate and maintain, but a skilled crew, well trained, managed by an experienced commander, could overcome these difficulties. Similar to Italian tanks, it would require the commander to carry out multiple duties. In fact, the small APX-4 turret was a single crewman turret. The commander would be gunner and loader, but the Italians would not require the turret after they managed to seize a handful of B1 Bis tanks. The number of Char B1 Bis tanks captured by the Italians seems to differ depending on the source. It could be as little as 2 or at most 20. The tanks were most likely recovered from abandoned factories of the FCM and sent to Italy. Some of the tanks lacked a turret. In Italy, engineers would carry out extensive testing on the vehicles. The Char B1 Bis would be the heaviest tank the Italians had since the Fiat 2000. That tank dated back to just after the First World War, a behemoth of a tank at 40 tons. But the Italians moved away from this weight, preferring to build smaller, lighter tanks through the 1930s. Trials took place in late 1941, where 2 Char B1 Bis tank chassis were tested against anti-tank obstacles. The hulls, lacking a turret, had a 60mm thick plate covering the hole in the roof where the turret would have been placed. Engineers did a lot of testing of the chassis. The testing did not end until May 1943, an unbelievably long time considering that there was a major war. The vehicle would be a repurposed project and did not require significant building or modification. Yet, by the time the testing was done, Italian engineers had moved on to other projects, such as Semovente on existing Caro M tank chassis. It is likely that the Italians would have used the vehicle as a Semovente. Limited mobility and traverse, plus a low velocity on the gun. The hull mounted 75mm. It would liken to a Semovente for indirect fire and direct fire support. To be honest, the shell velocity would be pretty terrible and difficult to use against tanks unless at short range. The Semovente B1 Bis was never adopted into service and was only ever used for experimental purposes. There are at least 2 prototypes that received registrations. The registrations were RE508 and RE750 in 1941. The tanks were complex. It wasn't a simple design. Maintenance of the vehicles would have been a challenge. Fuel and supplies would be an issue. It was for the French with the Char B1 Bis. Transporting these heavy beasts would have been difficult, if not impossible. Italy relied a lot on truck transporters or trailers. The Semovente B1 Bis would weigh a lot more than any existing Italian tank in service. The original Char B1 Bis with the turret weighed 28 tons. You could take off a few tons with the turret removed. There were no existing trailers or transporters that could hold that weight. The development of Semovente models on Caro M tank chassis could get larger numbers of vehicles out on the battlefield. They were smaller, less weight, and a simpler vehicle design. Italy had spent so long on the testing of the B1 Bis chassis that it made more sense to concentrate on the Semovente production program. Not only that, parts could be sourced and supplied more efficiently than for a foreign tank. It would be interesting to conclude with an assessment of the hypothetical impact had these vehicles entered service. Historians have different views on what sort of impact the Semovente B1 Bis would have had. Italian military historian Nicola Pignato, an author of many books on Italian military vehicles, suggested the Semovente B1 Bis could have provided much needed heavy armour and firepower for breakthrough operations, especially in the early war years. This is not based on historical facts and is open for debate. We will make the assumption that Italy can transport these heavy vehicles to the front lines of combat. It is quite feasible that the vehicles could have been ready for service during 1941, possibly seeing service before the first Semovente de 7518s entered the battlefields of North Africa. The Semovente B1 Bis possessed qualities that could have made it a strong breakthrough tank or assault gun for the Italian army, as argued by historian Nicola Pignato. Its heavy armour, up to 60mm on the frontal plate, would make it the most protected tank in Italian service at the time, far surpassing any domestic models. As a turretless self-propelled gun, the Italian adaptation aimed for the Semovente B1 Bis to deliver both direct and indirect fire, assisting infantry assaults or battering fortifications as an armoured spearhead. The hull-mounted 75mm gun was well suited for infantry support roles and targeting fortifications, but Italy had developed various cannons that could have replaced it. The vehicle did have limited mobility though, with 28 km/h top speed and lack of a traversing turret. It would make rapid advances or anti-tank combat less practical. However, an adaptation of the Italian armoured doctrine, a slow-moving vehicle like the Semovente B1 Bis, could be ably supported by fast-moving motorised infantry and lighter vehicles. The Semovente are positioned at the heart of the offensive formation. They could advance, drawing fire with adequate protection and firing back at the enemy, a focal point for the attack. Lighter, faster armoured vehicles and motorised infantry could attack from the flanks and exploit gaps and vulnerable enemy defensive positions. The M1340 tanks could be used on the flanks rather than leading the line as a breakthrough, possibly saving a lot of tanks from destruction. Through research, I have learnt about battles like Bir el Gubi and the action at Point 171 against the 3rd Indian Motor Brigade near Bir Hakeim that resulted in victories for the Ariete, Italy's best armoured division at the time. But they lost a lot of tanks during those battles because they were used aggressively or to meet enemy armour. The M13 didn't have sufficient armour for a breakthrough vehicle, but on the flanks and avoiding enemy fire, the tank could have performed better. Of course, getting the Semovente B1 Bis in operation is only going to happen if the army has adequate supplies for the tank, can reliably maintain them, and can provide sufficient training for the crews. All factors that I think the Italian army would have struggled with. The Semovente B1 Bis remains as a historical footnote, another Italian experimentation, one that led to nothing but a test vehicle. But it was a vehicle that had so much potential. Italy's logistical and technical limitations reduced it to obscurity, a project that is rarely talked about.